example of 740. Before we begin, all you're going to have to do is question 1, question 2, and question 3A. We're skipping question 3B and question 4. The reason for that is everybody in MGT 444 has to do the same assignments, but I'm tweaking them a little bit when I think they're make more sense to just go over together. So we'll go over 3B, or my example, with kind of the same thing as 3B. I called it 4, it should be 3B. And we'll do that together. So first of all, what I've done is I've taken a traditional income statement and instead put it into the contribution format income statement. What this does is it lets us make real quick decisions. And we start off the same in both, our sales revenue, and we end up the same net income. It's just the way we are calculating costs in between that varies. So your sales revenue minus your variable costs gives you your contribution margin. Subtract your fixed costs, that gives you net income. So if you look at the question, we have the following data refer to writer. Our sales were $80,000, our variable costs are $40,000, our fixed costs are $12,000, which is exactly what I put on here. The company can reduce their costs by purchasing material from a different supplier and renting a less expensive machine. If they do, their variable costs will be $3,000 per unit and their fixed costs will be $10,000. In number 1, we want to calculate the company's current income and determine the level of dollar sales needed to double that figure. And I already did that, right? Your sales minus your variable costs is your contribution margin, subtract your fixed costs, gives you net income. So to double this, you're going to take your net income and multiply it by 2. So my $28,000 net income multiplied by 2 is $56,000. I have then taken all my data and put it in a per unit basis. So remember, we had 10,000 units. So sales revenue of $80,000 divided by 10,000 is 8. Variable cost of $40,000 divided by our units of 10,000 is 4. And if you take your sales revenue and subtract your variable costs, that will give you your contribution margin of $4. Another way to do it is take your 40,000 contribution margin and divide it by your 10,000 units. Either way, you'll get the same amount. I'm now putting it in terms of ratios. And what we're doing when we're looking at our variable expense ratio and our contribution margin ratio, we're looking at it as a percentage of sales. Sales is, of course, 100% of sales. Variable costs are $4. So $4 divided by 8 is 50%. And contribution margin is 4 divided by the sales revenue per unit of 8, 50%. So now we know our contribution margin ratio. So for number 1, we are going to use this formula. Fixed costs plus target profit divided by contribution margin ratio. Our fixed costs are $12,000. Remember, our target profit is at $56,000, our $28,000 doubled. So $12,000 plus $56,000 goes in our numerator. We divide that by the contribution margin ratio, which is 50% or 0.5. So if you take 56 plus 12 is 68, and you divide it by 0.5, you will get 136,000. That's how you do number 1. Number 2 is a little different. We're going to determine our break-even point in units if we change suppliers and incur variable cost of $3. And we also rent the less expensive machine. So sales revenue is 8 per unit. Our variable cost is now 3, which means our contribution margin per unit is 5. 8 minus 3 is 5. To determine our, our level of units at break-even, we're going to take our fixed costs and divide it by our contribution margin per unit. So remember, our new fixed costs are $10,000 if we rent that less expensive machine. So fixed costs of $10,000 divided by $5 per unit contribution margin ratio, by our $5 contribution margin is 2,000 units. Number 3, we're going to use our same formula, break even at fixed cost divided by the contribution margin per unit. In this case, we're taking, if you look at 3A, at the beginning it says management wants to achieve the break-even point in units determined in number 2. Remember, that's 2,000 units. But not change suppliers or rent a less expensive machine. So that means we're taking our cost information from number 1. So for number 3A, this is 3A, we're going to have to take our fixed costs and divide it by contribution margin per unit. We don't know our fixed costs, right? That's what we're trying to figure out. So we're going to let X be fixed costs. We're going to divide that by our contribution margin, which remember was 4 per unit back in number 1. And we know the number of units we want to use is the same number of items determined in number 2. So it's 2,000 units. So what we have to do here, because we need to solve this algebraically, we divide, you just take the denominator amount, and you should take this amount and use it as a reciprocal. So you take your denominator of 4, divide it by 1, and multiply that by x over 4. When you multiply this out, the 4's cancel, and you get x over 1, which is equal to x. You have to then multiply the other side of the equation by 4 over 1. So 2,000 multiplied by 4 over 1 is 2,000 times 4, which is 8,000. So that's our answer for A. For B, if fixed costs remain constant, what does management do with variable costs per unit, and how much? Oh, I'm sorry, there's one other step in 3A, I almost forgot. In 3A, they're asking us, how much do fixed costs change? So we know our new fixed cost amount is 8,000. Our old fixed cost amount was 12. So 12,000 minus 8,000 is 4,000. So the change is 4,000. That's how much fixed costs must change by. They must decrease, and they must decrease by 4,000. Now we're going to look at 3B variable costs. We're just going to look at my example. You're not going to do this for the assignment. You're going to stop at 3A. But for 3B, if fixed costs remain constant, what must management do to variable costs per unit? How much must unit variable costs change? So we have our same formula, fixed cost over contribution margin per unit. In this case, we know our fixed costs are 12,000. We take that information from number 1. We do not know our contribution margin per unit, so we're going to make that X. We know our number of units, it's the same as number 2, right? So it's 2,000. So again, I need to multiply each side of the equation by x over 1. And by doing that and canceling out on this side of the equation, my x's cancel. So I end up with 12,000, which I have over here. And I have 2,000x divided by 1, which is 2,000x. In order to get x by itself, I must divide each side of the equation by 2,000. So 12,000 divided by 2,000 equals 6. And 2,000x divided by 2,000 equals x. So I know what I just figured out was my contribution margin, right? I know it's 6 per unit. So I'm going to go back to number 1, and I'm going to flip it. I'm going to subtract my contribution margin from my selling price, or my sales revenue. The reason for that is I'm trying to determine my variable expense now. So I take my selling price of 8. I know my contribution margin is 6. So 8 minus 6 is 2. So I know my new variable expense must be $2 per unit. Previously in number 1, my variable expense was 4, right? So 4 minus 2 means I must decrease my variable expenses by $2 per unit in order to achieve this. So again, you do not have to do 3B, you just have to do 3A, and remember to not only calculate what your new fixed costs will be, but remember, take your old fixed costs and subtract your new fixed cost amount to determine the change, and then say whether it's an increase or a decrease. So, have a good week, everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to call me.